So you clicked on this thumbnail because you were curious. How's this guy going to fix people's art? Now you may be asking yourself, what are his qualifications? What does he know? Well, reality check. I don't have any qualifications. I don't really know much, but I do know about character art. And I do happen to work in video games. So I guess that is a little bit of a qualification, maybe, to give feedback or something, I guess. I don't know, but we're here today to take a look at your art, and hopefully I can provide some insight on things that I might change to hopefully improve them and make them an overall improved model for your portfolio. Also, before you guys decide to come for me in the comments, all of these art pieces were sent over to me to take a look at, and I'm just trying to help and provide a little bit of feedback. So just know, I may be weird, but I'm not that type of weird where I go and pick people's art off the internet and decide I'm gonna fix it, okay? Okay, let's go ahead and jump right in. We're going to start with this one. This is by a Thiago. We'll jump into this one. This is going to be talking a little bit more about texturing and just some of the things that maybe I would adjust or start to think about or do a little bit differently. He also did provide me with a reference sheet, a pure ref. So what I wanted to point out with this one thing you'll really notice about the color palette is it's very muted when you're doing kind of like that post-apocalyptic sort of look. Because I think although there's color in it, what you can really notice is there's a lack of color in it. A lot of the colors are very unsaturated, you know, a lot of red, rusty reds, browns, tans, things like that. So I think that this is a really good thing to kind of key off how saturated your colors are looking. So that's going to be the first thing that I wanted to kind of point out is going to be some of the saturation. I think that the green jacket is probably okay. You might be able to desaturate it just a touch. The main culprit though that I did want to point out, and again, I guess it just depends on like which reference you are kind of aiming for. Like if you're aiming more towards this one, I think that's one thing you kind of have to get into unison is how saturated you want all of this stuff between all of your materials, because you don't want there to feel like there's kind of a disconnect. And what I'm really kind of keying off of here that I think is nice to see is the difference in saturation between the two. This one's much more of kind of like a washed out orange, whereas with yours, there's a little bit more saturation and kind of punch to it. If you were to reduce it a little bit more, I think it would help, because right now the primary focus in terms of like where my eye is going for color is more towards that red as opposed to up here. So I would pull out the saturation just a little bit from that area. One thing that I did want to point out, and I try to call this out when I see it, is just how dark you go with some materials. If you look at especially here on this reference, like the pieces that are probably pretty closer to like black as we would interpret them aren't really that black. Like this black leather is not really that black once the light starts to play off of it. Keep that in mind with like how dark you're going on like the things like this. You know, you don't want to go too dark, especially because once you bring this into a lighting scenario, one thing that you have to kind of consider is how the lighting is going to affect it. You're going to be fighting with the lighting to illuminate that area while all of the other stuff is going to start getting blown out. So just be careful with that. If you feel like they're in a good range, what I would recommend doing is using the PBR validator and just dragging and dropping this on top of those texture sets and see if anything flags red. That's just in regards to the like black values. One other thing on the saturation that I did want to mention, I might also desaturate this the brown leggings a little bit more, just so they aren't quite as saturated. Dropping the saturation of the skirt and that will kind of help seed everything together a little bit more in kind of the same color space. One thing that is standing out to me that I and this is a very common thing that I see in a lot of works, is lack of material definition. And I think you have it a good start in a lot of places, but I do think that there's a couple of areas where we could probably like push it a little bit further. And the main area that I'm seeing that is probably the leathers. If we kind of like swing around the model, you can see that it feels kind of dull. That's fine, but I would try and get like areas of light coming off of it, especially like even here, you can see this is like meant to be sort of like an old decrepit leather, but you're still getting like spots of highlight from the roughness map. So trying to introduce a little bit more depth and variation to the model with your roughness map, I think will really kind of help some of these leathers pop a little bit more. Even here on the corset, you kind of have some areas, but I would try and just push it a little bit further. Even with the metal, I might make that same feedback. I like a lot of like the color variation and stuff that you have going on it, but I think what we're missing right now is like really kind of distinct spots of like bright highlights. You can see that there's a lot of like variation and stuff going on the surface for it, but you're still getting like very distinct kind of like metal highlights in certain areas. So I would try and introduce that a little bit more. There's a lot of cloth, so that's going to kind of like overall dull the material response for the character. And then you want all of those things to distinctly kind of separate from each other. That is my primary feedback. Well, actually two things that I kind of notice from these that I like is one is the use of gradients. So especially in like this leather jacket, you can see down here, it's kind of like a darker, a little bit more preserved sort of leather. But as we start to move up the model, this top half of it starts to kind of receive a little bit more lightening, which one thing that's really useful about that is not only just kind of like accentuating the fact that maybe it's a little bit more sunbeaten, but it's using it as kind of like a natural tool to guide your eye. If you look at it, your eye kind of starts to naturally gravitate more towards the head because we're using that gradient to kind of push where the bright values are and where to look at the model to kind of just help guide more of the focus up here. And then, keeping the values down on the bottom half a little bit more muted and not as saturated, and still kind of playing with that same methodology down here so that overall we're just kind of guiding the eye up here. So that is the feedback for this one. Overall, great job, Thiago. There's a lot of awesome stuff here. Cool. So for this piece, let's see. I do have a couple of things that stand out to me right away. The first one that I did want to point out, we get kind of infatuated with the idea of details and pushing as much detail and, throwing anything and everything at the model. With this piece, I think that there is a lot of good fabric work going on the model, but I think that one thing that I would probably tone down is there's a lot of like these big memory wrinkles that are put into the model, especially like on the hood. Some of those are fine, but in the big picture, I feel like they're kind of muddying up a lot of like the wrinkles and the folds, and it's kind of compounding the wrinkle in a way that doesn't really add much. I think it kind of detracts from the sculpt and the model and the folds that we have going on. But coming in here and kind of reducing where they're at in certain areas, like especially on kind of like the front fabric piece, this like big shape and a lot of this stuff kind of feels unnecessary. It feels like there's a lot of like pinching and bunching when like I would expect the cloth to be laying over the chest a little bit flatter, a little bit more draped down. So just kind of picking those areas where you might be able to reduce that information, I think would be a good call in terms of the fabric. Now, in terms of the overall costuming, I like the colors. I think that there's a good play between the blue and the yellow, and that like pop of color is really kind of drawing my eye. So what I would recommend, depending on like the rest of the character, I would keep this color scheme and making sure that you are kind of continuing to draw emphasis here to the head. So how I talked about kind of using gradients in the last piece by Thiago, what I would recommend doing is maybe like darkening this bottom half and just using a gradient to kind of draw the eye further up here, because then you're kind of creating this like nice sandwich of like dark down here with this kind of like bright saturated yellow orange. So you're really kind of emphasizing that further focus on the face, which is ultimately when we're making characters, that's what we want, is we want that kind of emphasis on the face. One thing that I'm not sure about on this piece is I'm not 100% sure the material that we're trying to convey. Right now, it kind of has maybe like properties of like a felt fabric. One thing that's hard when viewing a substance file is we're not seeing the materials in their finality, I guess. We are limited just by what's in Substance Painter. So if there are material properties that are planned on being added on here, totally fine. You can ignore this. But that is something that I did just want to call out. There is a lot of kind of like sheen to it, a little bit of like more roughness to the material. So because of that, it's making me think maybe like more leather or more like a felt fabric material, but that kind of feels at odds with like the amount of light that's coming back. So I would keep that in mind. Really try and drive home the material that you're trying to create for the hood portion of the character, which I will say that I feel like you're doing a good job. It's convincing on this side for the kind of sash piece. I feel like that's kind of retaining those properties of like more of like a velvet sort of feel to it. So that one is looking good. The other thing that I did want to talk about for this piece is I think that the skin is looking pretty good. The only thing that I would recommend is right now, I feel like we're missing some of that like color breakup to it. But right now we just have this general like base sort of peach color. I would try in the face, especially trying to incorporate a little bit more of those color zones. So like the reds, the yellows, and then especially starting to bring it down here into like the chest area. I think right now the chest area feels like it's a little bit incomplete because of that. So getting a little bit more variation to it, a little bit more nuance, kind of that complexity of like surface irregularities, I think would really kind of help push it to another level. Another thing that I like and I feel like is potentially missing from these two garments is any sort of like color variation. And that I would say for like the piece in its entirety is trying to get in some more color breakup and variation to the surface. When I make materials, I don't view like my white hat. I don't view my white hat as strictly 100% white. And then like the detail that's added on top of it is what is color. I view like the base material as white. And then I add in like subtle nuances of color shift into it. And I feel like that really kind of adds a richness to the textures that I'm trying to create. Although it may not be 100% accurate, as artists were meant to make things and embellish how they look. So I would recommend trying that. I think that that would help to kind of break up a lot of your materials. You have a little bit of it going on here, like these big splotches of like coloration. There's like some of this kind of like darker green sort of look to it. I would try and incorporate that across your other materials as well. And I think that that would add a lot. The last thing that I would recommend for like the shoulder pieces, things like graphic shapes with like the grunge and grime that you're adding in. Don't just like throw an overall general rule of dirt across the model. Make it more localized. Really kind of think about like, well, maybe I can have like this kind of like big grease stain, but it can be localized to a spot that creates kind of like a medium shape detail on the model. That's what I would recommend. Like I said, overall, a lot of really great stuff on this one. Those are just the couple of notes that stood out to me. So this one was done by Francisco, and here is some of the final renders. So one thing I did want to initially call out when I first saw this that I think might help, and I'm noticing this a lot in like different viper eyes and some animal eyes, the main focal point for a lot of these is going to be the eye. And so what I like here is you're starting it, but I think what would really help is really kind of just making a big punchy statement for the eye to draw my focus right here to this point. To kind of illustrate this, what I have here are, I just searched the Viper that this was referencing, and there was a couple of pictures that really stood out to me. This one was a really good one where the eye has like a lot of pop to it. This one isn't the greatest one, but this one's a little bit better. You can see that there's a lot of like values of green, but then there's just kind of like this really bright saturated hit of a blue eye. So that kind of like draws my attention in right away. This is where my focus starts to go to. That is going to help kind of like keep the viewer's focus more towards the head, as opposed to right now, I think where my eyes kind of get drawn to is maybe like a little bit more in this area, the tongue, because there is that green to red contrast, and then maybe a little bit up here because there is that really dark to bright contrast, and it's happening very sharply on the scales. So I think that definitely would kind of be the first thing that I wanted to point out. Let's jump into the substance file. And I did have a couple of notes just regarding the model. One of the first things that I noticed that I think would just help it is thinking about how scales work on a real animal. right now, I think you had a lot of good scale placement all through like the head and down here. You have a good flow, but then right here through this neck area, I can tell that you decided, okay, well, I just want to use an alpha. But when using an alpha, one thing that I would recommend is you want to try and make sure that it feels cohesive. And I think that's the one thing that we're missing right now, is it feels like the scales are kind of just flowing in multiple directions. There isn't really much like natural flow to how they're essentially rolling across the model. And I can see like a couple of areas that look like maybe where the texture was starting to tile at. So that's what I would recommend. And if you guys have been following me, you know that I have a tendency of doing things the hard way. I'm not necessarily saying to do that. You don't have to go in there and hand sculpt every single scale by hand. But what I would recommend doing is maybe potentially coming in here, masking out the scales or drag rectangling out the scales and getting them to flow in a nice, like kind of cohesive sort of manner across the model. So what I wanted to show is this guy. So if we look at the scales, there is a natural kind of flow to them. And I think right now that is kind of what's missing, is because there's not that natural flow, we're getting like this sense of just kind of more chaos. I think it would really kind of just help emphasize some of these underlying structures as well, which you've done probably like 30% of the model. That extra like 10 to 20%, I think really would just push it over the line. So that's the first thing that I wanted to kind of call out in regards to the model. I think overall, like the face looks good and the scales and all that stuff look good, but just trying to introduce more of that like organic flow that you would expect. Okay, so in terms of the texturing, I like the color combination that you have. I think you're doing a good job with it. One of the things that I really like that I see about these images is there is kind of like a saturation and a pop to them, but they don't feel like they're in the lower half of the value spectrum. They all feel like they're pretty high, which, that saturation is really vibrant. And where we have it right now, I feel like there's green, but it's not like that, like kind of saturated, really punchy, poppy green, because right now I feel like all of the models kind of falling in a similar sort of like color range. And I think that would allow for a little bit more separation. Right now, the like main area that's kind of drawing my attention, this sharp kind of contrast between dark blue to like this bright green, I think trying to push it more in kind of this color range and value. Actually, maybe I am wrong. I don't know. I can't tell. I might be wrong. Throwing things out there that I think could maybe potentially improve it or make it better. I don't know. Maybe it won't. Test this stuff out. And if you're like, Jared, you're dumb, that looks worse, that's totally fine. But with that said, that's going to kind of wrap up our feedback. And that wraps up our first letting me fix your guys' art, I guess. If you guys found this cool or useful, make sure to like and comment below. If you want to participate in the next review session, make sure to join the Discord in the description below. Or if you want to make sure to have priority, make sure to join our YouTube memberships. If you guys found this helpful, make sure to like and subscribe, comment below, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.